A number of years ago, I was holidaying with a family up on the far north coast of Pottsville, Caravan Park, south of Kingscliff, where I was born up at Wollumbar and my family came from. There's many coxes and bailies up there. And we were driving up to Kingscliff and noticed that there was a Coogin rodeo was on that weekend that we were there. And so we decided that we would go and have a look at a country rodeo and show and see what was going to be like. For the Royal Easter Show was sort of lost something of that same sort of feel that it used to have. So we got ourselves dressed and ready and we went up to Coogin and down the track to where there was this brand new circuit that was the pen for the whole of the rodeo show. The only thing is that we got our times mixed up and we're probably about an hour early. So we were there and there was nobody else there and we were wandering around looking at it, all the brand new strip rails and the big posts and so on that was there. And this bloke came out and we were just there as family, as tourists, and was speaking to him. And he greeted us and said, it's a show. And I said, yes, we actually come a bit early. He said, yes, you have. And I made a comment. It looks like it's a brand new ring that you have that's been built. He said, yes, I built it. And I said, oh, did you? And we went on to talk a bit more about it and the show and what was going on. And he was just treating me as one of the many tourists that spend their summer on the beach. And he said, so you built it, did you? He said, yes, you wouldn't know where it was. I said, I have a timber mill at a place called Yukai. He said, you wouldn't know where that was. And I said, oh, yes, but I do. I said, my great uncle, my grandfather's twin brother, he owned a blacksmith shop at Yukai. And I used to play in this big shed about half the size of this building, with all its old buildings in it, and its brass, and its soldering, and its fire, and all that sort of thing. And I know where it was. It's not there anymore, because there's a lone way, and I described where it was no longer. And I said, oh, I'm a Cox. Oh, you're a Cox, eh? I went from being an outsider to an insider. And he came up to half at the intermission and said, are you enjoying the show? And was keen to know what I thought myself. The only problem is that in my own experience, that living and working in the Macarthur region of Sydney, as I did counselling for over 15, 20 years there, that I became different, politically, socially, theologically. And the far north coast of New South Wales is redneck country in terms of its politics, its faith, and its social understandings. I no longer fit there. I'm an outsider. Insider, outsider, insider, outsider. The story that we have here today deals with insiders and outsiders, and who they are and where the truth, where the stories really come from. It's almost a bit like a drama, and Mark's gospel is like that. Mark is brief, it's action-oriented, there's not a lot of reflection. He seeks to establish Jesus as greater than, showing that he's greater than the power of the physical world, the natural world, the spiritual religious world, and the supernatural world. And that's the essence of so much of the early gospel passages of Mark. And in chapters 2 and 3, which is a lead up to the passage that we have, Jesus is over against the Pharisees and the scribes and the religious leaders. He doesn't fast. He associates with sinners, tax collectors, and prostitutes. He plucks grain on the Sabbath because his disciples are hungry. And he even heals on the Sabbath people who are sick. There's a story within a story. There is this story of the beginning and the early energy, the early conflict that continues throughout between Jesus and the religious leaders. And then we have another story that's going on parallel to this. That's Jesus and his family, as Mark describes it. The story within the story that is there. And some people, it's a bit like, I think there's a current ad on TV, it's about people who have the adventurous gene. I'm not quite sure what it's connected with, but in some ways I think, if you read the story just here, Jesus has got that adventurous gene. You know, he's out of his mind. What the dickens does he think he's doing? And there is this insider and outsider story. The insiders are family and the religious leaders who we would have expected to have recognised that Jesus was here and representing the true reign of God as God intended it. And yet the flow goes to the outsiders, away from them, to the disciples, and a question about familial relationships. There is this pattern that's in Mark's Gospel that goes from opening up these shoes with the people who should have known, a crunch moment, and then are now working into a different way of understanding. It's a pattern that exists over and over again in the Gospel of Mark. And then there's an intermission in this story. If you think of it almost as a play, there's an intermission. Because unlike in other Gospels of the same story, Mark breaks it by saying, and he calls the disciples. And he goes through and he calls the disciples, and he calls them and to send them out to preach and to heal. But for Mark, this is an important part of bringing together the outsiders. I can imagine a family back home saying a conversation like this. Doesn't he know where he comes from? We come from Nazareth. Or you might say Redfern, Claymore, Blackett, Green Valley, Walgett, Wilcannia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Sri Lanka, Myanmar. He's just the son of a carpenter or a boat builder or someone who trades in cloth. Who does he think he is? He's out of his mind. Doesn't he realise that he's going to cause us as a family trouble if he keeps doing what he's doing? Not only trouble, but probably shame upon our family. And yet you would think that they would have known and maybe seen something about this odd person that even in his early life somehow didn't quite fit what was anticipated and expected of him. And the religious leaders are not much different. There's this mounting evidence of this person who is doing things and gathering around him a collection of people who are keen to follow him. Jesus is challenging the orthodoxy of the time. And you would think that they also, people who are looking for the reign of God to come, would have recognised the activity of God in a person's life. But he didn't fit. The traditions were not being upheld. Traditions that go back, and even as it goes back into that reading of Samuel, where they want to keep, we want to be like everybody else. We want to conform, we want to be the same, rather than being unique. And it's a bit like, that Paul Hogan in Crocodile Dundee. It's a bit like, you want someone to rule over you, you want a king, I'll show you a king. You'll be slaves, you'll have 10% given off, you'll be part of the military, you'll become this, you will lose all that you have. And religious leaders going all the way through, upholding what have become their own practices. A bit like Sepp Blatter. Christian churches in response to sexual abuse. Political parties who do not want their policies to deal with asylum seekers, refugees, who face horrendous situations in illegal detention. But the churches also today struggle, I think, with alternate models and approaches to the gospel. To how do we recognise God's presence in action? And I think it's 38 years coming up, 77. United Church began. Long enough to create its own orthodoxy, its own position that may be relevant at its inception, but no longer serves it well today. I think the making of disciples and the commitment to being a follower in a new and imagined way is something that we struggle with. Coming out of the Baptist tradition as I have, where guilt was laid on people, there was all that heavy burden stuff. But what does it mean to call somebody to be an active, committed disciple? Is something I think we struggle with. How does a church, and I grew up in a church that split twice, so I know what it is to struggle. But how does this church move past almost dying to come back to life? And those things which held us and you and us together serve so well, but now may be an orthodoxy that needs to be rethought. The religious leaders, the insiders, they were supposed to recognise the presence and activity of God, but did not see that in Jesus. And so they come to confront him. And there's an interesting Greek word in verse 23, and it says that Jesus called them. Rather than being threatened by them, he was the one who threatened. And the word that is there, he called them to, is the same word in verse 13, where Jesus calls the disciples. And the word is actually means summoned. It has a very strong sense. And so Jesus doesn't back away, but he meets them. He meets them to challenge them with their inconsistency of logic. How can someone who is of the devil cast out the devil? How can someone plunder a house of a strong man and kept the first bind of a strong man? And their denial and inability to see the Spirit of God was what keeps them separate from God. And I wonder, even today, how our inability in certain areas of our life to see the work and activity of God that is different to our expectations keeps us from understanding and seeing the work of God. Failure to recognise that separates us from each other, ourselves, and God. And so we come back to the drama. It's almost as though you've got you can see the family getting in their car, coming down, we're going to get Jesus, and we're going to save him from himself if he can't save anybody else. And they say to him, your mother and your brothers are outside. And Jesus says, who are my father and who are my mother and my brothers? Almost a line might get stolen from another part. I must be about my Father's business. And Jesus challenges that. Your mother and mother and father and brothers are outside. And so you have this movement from those who should have known, don't understand. And Jesus calls a motley crew of disciples and then says to those around him, those who actually ultimately are truly intimate with me are marked not by familiar relationships, but by a desire of heart to live under the reign of God, no matter what it costs. There are more questions, but there are two questions that arise for me from this passage. What do we need to name and to call in ourselves at this point that we are blind to? As a community of faith, we have been active in naming injustice in our society. And we are known for that. We are known for being inclusive and welcoming. And secondly, what we fail to recognise as God's work and challenging us that are foreign to us. What is the orthodoxy that we hold to? What are the new ways in which God's Spirit would be present within us if we have eyes to see and ears to hear? I went to Campbelltown as a Baptist, not struggling, but in a process of renewal. I came as I used to call myself a Baptist A-grade processed sausage. My family goes back into the 1700s, so I can trace it as Baptist heritage. And it was in that process there, as I said before, that in sitting and listening to stories of trying to struggle with where does my faith and theology fit this story, brought me to change socially, personally, politically and theologically, and my spiritual journey. I saw people who made no claim to faith bring about peace, where I saw people within the church bring about destruction. Not the whole church, but there were certainly strong elements to it. I came to understand that as I really sat at the feet of others, did I truly understand them and could respond to them. Similarly, I have seen God at work in the lives of those who are blind, the weak, the lame, those in cognitive decline, and in wheelchairs. A man with dementia was walking with me back to his unit, sees a woman with Parkinson's and other mental disorders shuffle along the corridor, and he says to me, in all seriousness, how sad when you saw her. I would hate to be like that. A man with dementia, seeing that in a woman. Or a man who goes past my office, walking stiff-legged, he's over 6 foot, walking stiff-legged with a walker because he can't bend his knees. Goes down past my office back to his room. A couple of minutes later I come out and I see him coming back, still with his own walker and shuffling, but this time with a blind man's hand on his shoulder, taking him out to reception where he needed to go. Someone with hands that are struggling with arthritis, cutting up food for a woman whose hands are now withered because of a stroke. That's where God is. In these people. Where do you see God at work? And how does it challenge you to be different? It's only as we dare to be different do we find liberation in ourselves if we attempt to liberate.